I do every week. We're now officially being recorded. Okay, so what? Oh dear, that professor. That still says week 4. It's been that way for like probably 2 years. Okay, hit save, and now we'll go back to sharing my screen. First of all, I'll give the usual. Can everyone see my agenda screen, my exciting PowerPoints? Okay, so do our usual Q&A, which is usually me just saying, hi, Q&A, but then we'll go over the quiz from the beta quiz, my super cool PowerPoints, and there are going to be some questions on assignment gamma I'm going to go over, and week 5 postings I'm going to go over, because we have a different types of doing the posting today. So that's how we hit it. So first, any questions? What do you do? What do you know? What do you want to know? What do you think we should know? Anything pestering your mind other than the topics that we're going to go over already? Okay, we'll go back. Quiz beta. So top score, like last time, were people who got 30 out of 30. Bottom score was better than last time, was 16 out of 30. Average, well, actually went down a little bit, with 22 out of 30. That does include some people that actually didn't take it. Average, actually I'm kind of happy. The average time went up a few minutes to 24 minutes, 51 seconds, which means people actually took more time. I didn't consider that much harder quiz. I'm going to point out a couple of things though. I put this graph out here to show you, we actually have, for those of you who haven't had my stats class, an inverted bell curve. Normally, a quiz like this goes low at the A's, then whooshes up in the mid-range and down. In fact, that's considered a perfect quiz if you have a nice little normal distribution curve. So remember that from your algebra classes. But we actually had a spike at A's and B's and a spike at D's and F's. So I really actually delved into why we had so many people at this end, or actually as many people who fell into the F category as the A category. And there's one thing that everyone in this last unpleasant category has in common. They all started the course late, after 10 o'clock. And one person actually finished right last minute. With one exception, one person in this nice category over the left actually started after 10 o'clock, finished less than half an hour, and took his A and left. But almost everyone in these two, everyone in this one started after 10 p.m. Sunday night before they took the quiz. So I don't know, that means that you oops, forgot it, got a reminder and took it last minute and hadn't read the chapters beforehand, because this last quiz was one. If you didn't read the chapters until it was right before the quiz, Lord help you in a couple of those computational questions. And those seem to be the ones that threw people, when I looked at, it's been a long time going over this quiz to say, okay, why did we get this weird thing where we had more brilliant people, shall we say, that got the B's and A's than last time, but they were counterbalanced. And the biggest thing I can see is people that fell into this, to the right side of this graph, tended to take the test very late on Sunday. Almost like they say it was a last minute thing for that week. So think about that going forward. Won't go on to that too much longer, but that's the one thing I found when I tried to figure out why we had such a weird thing going on. But the one commonality of people over here was they started late Sunday evening, meaning within two hours or less before the quiz was due. Okay.
Question.
Who had a question? Yes.
I was looking at the quiz beta, and so question 11, I'm not really understanding why it's supply instead of, well, why it's demand instead of supply.
Well, one thing I say, if you want to shoot me, and I can pull that question 11 up when the rest of the class is looking. The only way to pull up that question right now for me is we'll show everyone's grades.
Got it. Okay.
I'll go over a couple of questions, but I can look up question 11 when we're offline, and then go into that.
Can I read it?
Post the answer for everybody, but I can't. I mean, believe it or not, as brilliant as I am, I haven't memorized all the questions in order with the answers.
Could I read it off?
Let's go. Let me go over a couple more questions first, and let me pull it up, because I have to and read the question. So let me go for it. I'll be happy to post it tomorrow with detailed answers or even do a recording if I think it's more of that. But let me post that, and I'm going to make a note of it on my notes here. Question 11, give me, just in case, I don't think I randomized the order, so everyone else should have the same question 11. So what's the nature of the question? Just give me a quick summary, or read it quickly so I can remember it in case I forget tomorrow.
It's talking about U.S. Congress wants to pass a special tax on airplanes.
Okay, I think I remember that one, and that's the one where it says, okay, elastic, and I hate to go with this on the fly because I don't have the exact question in front of me, but I believe that was saying, is demand elastic versus inelastic to make the tax successful? And if I am remembering it correctly, and so I'll be happy to look into it and say, yes, what I said tonight was right or wrong later. But in order to make a tax, and this is the gist of the question, if memory serves, successful, when it's called successful, I use that in quotes. When you tax something, you're making it more expensive. And so that comes into the reason for your taxes. If you want a tax is going to be successful, meaning generate revenue from that standpoint, and this is where I have to remember the exact context of the question, but if you're trying to generate more revenue, you don't want people to be price sensitive about the item you're taxing. So to be a successful tax, and I use that in quotes, then you don't want to have them be, this is where the elastic versus inelastic and its demand becomes, because are people going to be inelastic or elastic on their demand, meaning will they buy less if the price goes up a little bit? And this is often the problem when you tax things, that people start buying less of it. Now this is going on a counter example on this is, okay, if you want to discourage something, and I hate to say it, but that's a great segue in today's topics for chapter 5. If you want to discourage something, you tax it a lot to make it more expensive so people won't buy it. Alcohol and cigarettes have traditionally been a thing like that we tax because society decided that alcohol and cigarettes is bad, so we want to depress demand. But if your purpose, as a question, if I remember what purpose would say, okay, we're going to generate more revenue from this tax. Well, if the government's purpose of putting the tax on is to generate more revenue, we want people to not be price sensitive about the item being taxed. So that's why it's demand is the issue, because is it elastic or inelastic, or are people going to be, still buy it even if the price goes up? Now let me double check on that when I had the question in front of me to make sure I got the phrase in the question right and answered it in context. But I believe, if memory serves, again, I put this quiz together like 4 weeks ago, but I believe that was the purpose of it.
Okay.
All right. Most missed question though was because, this is the question.
Yep.
Oh, that's it. So we just went over it. Yes, the tax removal, this shows you I should pay more attention. So it's inelastic for the very reason it would be effective. In this case, the effect because the effectiveness here, and that's why I was waiting for that sentence I didn't see. Raising new tax revenues. The purpose of the tax was to raise new tax revenues, not to stop people buying airline tickets. That's chapter 5, talk about later tonight. So the purpose of raising new revenues, if you want that to happen, well, you need people who won't stop buying airline tickets when they're more expensive. So that's where it was. So we just talked about, so I remembered correctly. That doesn't always happen. Write it down on this day. Dr. Ian King remembered his question.
So the key words here is most effective in raising new tax revenues.
Correct. Now, if it had said, you would have had a different answer necessarily if it said, we don't want people to fly in airplanes anymore. It would have changed the context of the question, meaning we want people to stop buying it. In that case, well, if the goal was to stop people from flying airplanes, then you want to have it, want people being very, very, very price sensitive, if you will. Another question I had was on the calculations for, I can't remember which question number this was, but is one of the calculation questions on what is the price elasticity. And this is one of those questions where the averages method comes in. Now remember, we talked about two methods of doing your elasticity of demand and supply last time. Oops, got to admit someone. Give me just a minute. Oh, they disappeared when I was trying to admit them. Try again. They're back. Okay. Now then, we talked about that averages method and the just simple slope method where you do the relative percent difference of one versus relative percent difference of the other. And this is a great question that demonstrates why the averages method works. Because remember on that chapter, I don't have my book open. Let me reach across and pull the book so I can, if anyone's got the book following along, I can pull it up and say, go to chapter whatever it is, on page whatever it is. So we're going to elasticity. I'm trying to go to the using averages. If you're on the text, I'm on page 78. Now I talk about, maybe the reason I talk about averages is better is because of the complication nature of demand and supply curves and how they're not nice straight lines and such like that. The other thing that comes up, and they talk about this on that chapter set or page 78, is that depending which way you're going, you can get different elasticities. Meaning, are you going from a low price to high price or high price to low price in your changes? In this case, we talk about the averages, and I have this little question 8 it was on the quiz. I wrote it down on quiz beta question 8. I put a graph down there and just graphed the data. And the averages method, because you're just taking average distance changes, if you will, on the numerator and the denominator, and the price or quantity, it doesn't matter which direction you go. But going from when you have remember, old versus new, 60 minus 40 divided by 60 is different than 60 minus 40 divided by 40. And so if you use the straightforward method, the first one I talked about last week, that can give you different numbers for the same curve, just by depending, are you going up the curve or down the curve? And that's another reason the averages method is used so much. And then I say, in the real world, we don't have nice straight demand curves like this. So, okay, it's easy to say rise over run, and that's why I always say last week, think of the demand factor, if you will, or supply elasticity as a slope conceptually. The purist is going to say, no, you horrible mathematician, why are you saying that's a slope? It's not. Technically they're true, but conceptually to think about it, it's like thinking about the slope of the line. But like in calculus, the slope of the line changes every point you're on the line. So averages allows you to say, I don't care what the curve's doing. Here's the starting point, the ending point. As long as you have the ending point or starting point and ending point, you reverse them, it's the same. So you have the old quantity, 40, new quantity 6. Difference is 20. But remember, we're looking at absolute values. The price reference, which is they use that in the book where you have one, basically the average of the two, one minus the other, or the adding together divided by 2. In this case, you add 40 plus 60 divided by 2, just like the price. 9 plus 7 divided by 2 is a price reference. That's how I use price reference because that's how they refer to it in the book, that little calculation. Cool, so your change in quantity is lower 40%, your change in price is 25%. So your minus 40 divided by 25, again, absolute values is 1.6. If you did this on the straightforward method, you wouldn't have found the answer among the options. And that's why I said, if you're not sure what price method they're using, they're either going to tell it to you, or if you can't find it, there was none of the above option on the question. So then the averages method. A strict purist to say you should always use the averages method because it's safest. It doesn't always make a germane difference, but you're going to go less wrong and more often, or less wrong more often, less wrong. Go to the grammar there. We need an English major in this class. But averages is safer because it will cover any type of curve shape you have. So until you get into calculus and want to do rise over run on an average actual function. So this is how we got the 1.6. Basically, you use the averages method on the quantity and the price, and you ended up with a 40% divided by 25%, which gave you the 1.6. So if in doubt, unless you're told otherwise, average method is safer, and that's why the book pushes it so much. To me, the only thing I don't like about it is it gets things a little complicated. It starts talking about math and that, where this really, on a 200 level course, we should just be talking more conceptually. But the author is not wrong in pushing the averages method. Okay, any more questions on that one, on question 8? No one's giving anything. All right, so let's go down to this chapter. And this is where I give my disclaimer. I've been talking about this chapter coming up for a long time, because this is where I have a philosophical difference with this chapter in all economics books, but on this particular subject, but I'm in the minority. So if other professors say, hey, why is this dude so down on this? You can say, well, that's just Professor King, and he's always down on it. And he knows he's in the minority, but I'm older than some folks. So I can say, yes, in my day, sitting on the rocking chair with a pipe, in my day, we didn't call it market failures. So, market fails to produce the right amount of product. This is where we're trying to talk about market failures. Meaning resources may be over-allocated and under-allocated. So, that already should start getting some people to think about, what does it mean to be over-allocated and under-allocated? We'll get there. And if you're really thinking forward, you say, well, who decides whether it's over-allocated or under-allocated? This is where we'll get into my pontificating about my philosophy on market failures. So they have this, all along through this, we have efficiently functioning markets. Demand curve shifts to willingness to pay on consumers. Supply curve reflects what people do as far as what they can produce for whatever price they get. And we talked about that a lot. Now then, the market failure occurs, as it says on here, so this is straight from the book, so I'm going to read it so people will say I didn't distort it. Market failure occurs when the demand curve and or supply curve does not function as described above. Well, that sounds really cool. It doesn't reflect consumers' full willingness to pay or the cost of resources used. Now then, why do we care? Well, here's my view on market failures. It's a nice day. You've done well with your capital gains tax, so you're taking your yacht out. You're going to have a nice place on the ocean because you say, hey, I want to go out and have a nice day on the sunny side of the ocean and it's calm seas, take my sailboat out and just enjoy it. Well, the sea has other ideas. The sea, like markets, is treacherous. It reacts as it wants to react. It reacts because of numerous things, not all of which we can predict, like weather reports and that. And so you might have an unpleasant day when your objective was to go out there and sail in the sun and have a nice cozy time out in the ocean. So but we get this really nasty experience instead, do we say the ocean failed? Well, the ocean does what it does, not necessarily what we want it to do. But if we're going out because we expect a nice sunny afternoon, but we've got this treacherous sea, do we say the ocean failed? I'm the old-fashioned type that said, well, saying the market failed, well, the market does what it does. Unless someone's out there actually manipulating the market, insider trading, all that type of stuff, which is illegal, like a stock for the stock market as an example. Well, markets by their nature are unforgiving. They don't do what we want, they do what that invisible hand wants. And as the invisible hand said, it should be a stormy sea because, well, you didn't predict all the things you should predict. You didn't allocate your resources correctly. You didn't build a bigger boat. Do we say the ocean failed? That's how I view markets. Well, we do all we can to predict what we should do and prepare ourselves as business entities and individuals to be out there and ready for whatever comes at us. But sometimes a storm hits us and we didn't prepare enough. And that's my philosophy towards market failures and why I will disagree with things like this. Well, overallocated, allocated, or underallocated. In the long run, the market will take care of that. Doesn't mean everyone gets a Bentley, but the market wins just like the ocean will win. So that's my pontificating example of why I differ from the author's attitude, and again, most authors' attitudes. But I didn't write the book, and the person who wrote the book is probably making a heck of a lot more money than I do, so the market's being fair to him. So back up for a second and think about the basic tenets that we want in manufacturing processes from an economic standpoint, and that is efficiency. Economists, again, like efficiency. That's that supply and demand curve. We cross each other at the most efficient point. They hate waste. Think of that production possibility curve from chapters 1 and 2, where he said we're on that curve, everything's efficient. Those gun versus butter arguments he talks about, or plain versus peanut. As long as we're on that curve, we're efficient. If we're inside the curve, those production possibilities curve, and that's where it's important, production possibility, what is possible to produce? If we're not on that curve, we're either inside the curve, underproducing from an efficient standpoint. Outside the curve, we're overproducing, which can't be done indefinitely. So that efficiency standpoint that we looked in those early chapters needs to be in your mindset as we talk about productive efficiency, producing what we can at the lowest cost, because consumers like less expensive things. So, and then there's allocative efficiency. And this is where we start to sort of lead into sociological aspects from an accounting standpoint. Production most valued by society, resources allocated efficiently. Markets don't always care about what society wants. They do what the market in the business world, in terms of consumers and producers, will buy and sell, and at what price it will buy and sell. We may want everyone to have, from a societal standpoint, a Prius for $2,000 a piece, but the suppliers can't supply it for that, even though consumers might want a $2,000 Prius that doesn't pollute as much as an F-150. Well, is that inefficiency if we decide as a society that should happen? Well, that's where allocative efficiency comes in versus the natural resources of efficiency from a M&M's plain versus peanut, and this is what we can produce. The society comes in and says, no, you know, what we really need is everyone needs peanut M&Ms. Well, the producer of peanut M&Ms may not be able to produce them at the quantities we need at a price we decide society should have them. So that's where we get into these allocative, is how should society allocate these resources? And that's something that's maybe different than the raw, cruel markets of the ocean may dictate. So consumer surplus, which will deal with the difference between the maximum price a consumer are willing to pay for a product and the actual price. How do we make that difference happen? That's why we're here tonight, to talk about how we make that happen. So the chapter goes into public goods, and this is an ongoing, again, as I said before, we tend to bleed into sociological and political issues in this chapter. My objective is not to be political. My objective is to say this is how it works. You can argue about what we should be producing and how we're directing stuff. I'm just saying here's the mechanics of it. Go argue with your political science professor or your sociological professor about whether it's the right thing to push. I'm just saying here's how it works. So public goods are provided by the government, an entity that we all live to. They're ordered for free, and they say our taxes free. They are paid for, but they're provided by the government. If you go to a public park or enjoy police or fire protection, what are those things? Those are things that are provided by the government. And they're typically characterized as a non-rivalry, meaning, you know, the government is producing the military, generally speaking, and don't get into political things and you know, private militias, but the government doesn't have much competition theoretically in this country for the army it provides. Your city doesn't have a lot of competition for the sheriff's or police department. They are established by the government. They are the entity that provides that service. It's non-rivalry. You don't have people bidding. This did happen back east in the 70s, but you don't have people generally bidding for the lowest contract to come out and police your community if it's covered by public goods. So we have a public community police department. It's non-rivalry. We're not like competing for the lowest police officer to come to your door when you call them. You call one number, they show up, they're provided by the government. Same with fire department. We have a fire department that pays for it. You have public parks they're public by definition because anyone can go to them. They're provided for all our benefit. Non-excludability means you can't basically shut people out of it if you wanted to. Can you shut people out and say, okay, the firemen aren't going to respond to your house because you didn't pay your taxes that year? So that doesn't work that way. You can't go to the park because of whatever reason. That's the non-excludability. Public goods are out there for everyone in the domain of that public organization, whether it be your state, local, or federal government. You can't exclude people generally from them, and there's no competition for them. Do you have a question, Marcos? Cool. Hearing none, keep going.
So,
go on.
I'm sorry.
No,
It's more, is there a baseline to what is offered? Like you said, you're not asking for the lowest ranking officer when you're calling the phone. It's just someone comes out. So is there like a baseline to what it is, or you get what you get?
That then gets into the societal problem that we elect people to government to establish that.
Okay.
And that is the government, which in this United States is more or less us. Again, I'm not going to get into political arguments about that, but there is an entity, a governmental oversight in whatever that is. It could be your park district, it could be your water district, it could be your municipal government, your mayor and city council, or these people we send to Congress. They have the authority over whatever element of this is. It's kind of like saying, okay, look, the military is a great example of this. We have military out there that defends, preserves, protects, and defends the Constitution. If anyone else has ever taken an oath. Or we're going to say, we're going to exclude you from it because, we're going to protect everyone's house but Ian's on this block. Well, when missiles start flying, are they going to say, oh, well, I don't intercept any missiles heading for Ian's house, but no, protect his neighbors on either side of him? It's really hard to do that from a practical standpoint. I'm non-excludable, if you will. So in non-rivalry, we don't have too many competing U.S. armies in the United States that compete with our United States Army. Non-rivalry. So the government has domain over that as they elect to do so, as we elect them to elect to do so. Now then, non-rivalry consumption. Some of these we just talked about, so I'll go through this part really quickly. One person's consumption of good does not prevent anyone else from consuming it too. I enjoy the protection of our army. The fact that I'm enjoying the protection of our army doesn't mean no one else on this call enjoys the protection of our army. Just because I enjoy having firemen that will show up doesn't mean I'm preventing anyone else from have firemen from showing up their place. So national defense, lighthouse beacons, clean air. If the government does things to policies to keep our air clean, they're not going to say everyone but Ian gets clean air. That's
question about that. So, they, of course, they do laws to protect it, but like you said, clean air. How is that truly regulated? I mean,
from a standpoint of non-rival consumption, are we going to say everyone in this town but Marcus gets to breathe the clean air? How do you do that practically?
Right.
That the Dr. Seuss comics we've been talking about the last couple of weeks aside, how do I say, again, national defense, how do I say everyone but Ian on his block is protected by our national defense systems? That's when it's sort of non-rival. In fact, I'm protected by our Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines. Doesn't mean that everyone else is being prevented by that as well. And the fact that you can't stop me from getting that protection, that's where you get into the non-excludability in a minute. But the fact that I'm protected doesn't stop anyone else from being protected. I might be using GPS satellite systems sent out by the US government. The fact that I'm using them on my phone doesn't necessarily prevent anyone else from using them. The fact that I have clean air due to laws we've set doesn't mean that no one else is being prevented from doing it as well.
So is the opposite true? That means that if that person can pollute the air, then everyone can pollute the air, or
well, that's no, that's when you get into a legal philosophical aspect
oh,
from
okay, so
laws and stuff we're doing.
the
If,
opposite isn't true.
no, not straightly. I would say no.
Okay.
Now then,
Uh,
public goods,
so,
non-payers. Oh, go on.
one example that I can think of where one person like wouldn't be able to use something when someone else, or well, basically at like a public park, if let's say a baseball team is using like a field, then you can't have like someone walking their dog in the middle of outfield, or like trying to set up a game of volleyball in the outfield.
Yeah. No, I see where you're going, but I think in one sense you're saying, does that mean that no one else can use that park? Yes, we can say, okay, that argument I would say is a bit like saying
that partially comes to a safety issue.
yeah. Well, also I would say it'd be like saying because I can't stand on the same piece of pavement at the same time you are, am I excluding you from that piece of pavement? And that's what I type the same type of thing. No, we're not excluding that dog walker from using the park, and we'd be able to reserve it for certain things, but it doesn't mean that dog walker can't reserve that at another time. So
That's
yes,
true.
I can't breathe the exact same air that you're breathing in that same moment. It doesn't mean I'm excluding you from air, but there's logistical things where if we're in the same room, what's that old joke? You breathe in my air. But that type of thing, we may not be able to stand on the same exact piece of pavement at the same time, but that doesn't mean I'm excluding someone from that public good.
It's kind of like you're talking about a public park versus like a private park. If I had my own park, I could tell you, no, you can't come play baseball at my park. This
I mean, actually, I hate to say it, but that happens in like gated communities.
Yeah.
Where you have that, and that's not necessarily a public good in that gated community. That is a private good that those people have set up in their park or their community, and unless you're part of that community, you're excluded. So that, by definition, would not be a public good because it's a private park.
Another question that I that kind of came up was, is federal okay, is local and like federal like a different thing? Because in some parts, at least where I came from in Arizona, it sometimes if you don't pay something, they'll let your house burn down, but not your neighbors, because the fire department is metro and will go to the neighbors, which is part of the county, but not go to you because you're part of the city.
Well, again, and that is a great example, and in one sense, we're getting into the weeds of it. But until recently, we were part of a different district in Hillsborough, my house, and now we just became part of Tuolumne Fire and Rescue, or Tuolumne Hills Park, not Park, Recreation District. I'm getting mixed up. The THPRD, Fire and Tuolumne Hills Park, and I'm getting my acronyms mixed up with the fire department. But I mean, in one sense, yes, from municipal boundaries. In that case, I would say if you're not part of that municipal boundary that's part of that fire department, well, that public good is built for people in that boundary. And so you're not going to exclude it to anyone within that governmental entity's authority. It's not excluding people. But if someone's coming next door, just outside that boundaries, they may not respond to them because that's not part of the entity. Now, as a side part, I know that almost every entity in Oregon, from my time in government, has some reciprocal things. I mean, like where I am, technically I'm covered by the sheriffs. But in an emergency, if there's an overweight somewhere, Beaverton actually may come to my house, even though I'm not in school city limits of Beaverton. So they do have, from a practical standpoint, they have cross-functional entities coverage in the Portland metro area. But if I'm not part of that government entity that controls that good, I'm not excluded if I'm outside the boundaries of that public entity. Now, again, when we get down to it, if I try to go to Hillsborough, one of the parks in Hillsborough, which technically aren't part of the Tualatin Party Recreation District. Unless they really want to exclude me by having an officer there and checking my ID to say, oh, you came from Aloha, you better turn around. Now we're getting to a little bit of the weeds of, okay, is that really conceptually where we're going with that? I would say no. So yes, do different people, does the United States send its army to protect certain other countries? If they have certain other treaties, yes. But the main purpose of is our national defense. So yeah, different jurisdictions have control over different entities. So generally you think about it within the entity of government organization that you're operating within. Long-winded answer. So people cannot be excluded from obtaining the benefit. Again, within the same confines of that government entity, there's no way for producers to exclude someone from receiving the benefit provided by goods. So there's a way to determine how much consumers are willing to pay for it. That's part of the crux of this, that pay for it, because when it's a public good, that supply and demand curve starts to fall out of place, because if you can use it, like the parks, until there's so many people in there that you can't stand in there, how much are we willing to pay for your park? Would you be willing to pay for be in your park versus someone else? Well, we sort of lose that demand. We know where the supply is. We can see, look, the park's on the map. There's the supply of parks. How much are we willing to pay for it? Well, since we get everyone there of different payment levels and income levels that can use that and access that good, we really lose that supply demand aspect of it as to where the right price point is and equilibrium is for that good called a public park. So this also leads to the free rider problem. And this is where it kind of gets to what Marcos was saying. If I don't pay taxes into Hillsborough's park system, I can still go there unless they're going to set up people with, to check my ID as I walk into the park. I get a free rider. I get the benefit of using that park without necessarily my taxes going to pay for it. Just like someone from Hillsborough can come to the THPRD park over just off 185th and say, I'm going to use this park. So unless you're willing to set up armed guards to stop people coming out and check their IDs, it's free riding. Another example is, and this is where free riding is generally benefiting from the cost from somewhere else. It's being borne by other people. I'm benefiting from Hillsborough taxpayers when I go to a Hillsborough park, but I'm not paying for it. Just like they might be benefiting from THPRD park when they're not paying for it because they're taxes. On the other hand, I have a free rider point because I'm surrounded by farms. And one of my neighbors on two sides is really up on rodent control. He stakes out gopher traps everywhere and makes sure, because he has wheat he's worried about. But you know what? Because of that, I don't have to stake out for my gophers, because he's like covered me on two sides and he does great gopher control. I benefit from his expenses on rodent control just by being next to him. So I'm essentially free riding off of his rodent control. Although I did have a horrible experience with chipmunks last summer. They're evil things that shouldn't be judged by their cute faces. But we'll go to that later. But I'm a free rider on his rodent control efforts. On the other hand, too, we can argue our free riding. We'll talk about this more in just a minute in a couple of slides. He has 13 acres out my backyard, all in beautiful wheat. I don't pay for it. I don't pay his taxes. But I have a fantastic view of the Coast Range right across his property, which is next door to mine, because it's flat, green. So I benefit from his open range property without paying for it. I'm a free rider on his land because I don't contribute to his land as far as paying for it, but I get a great view and rodent control for being next to this really conscientious farmer, Farmer Bill. And so, again, that kind of messes up how much would I be willing to pay for that view? Well, I don't pay for that view, so what's it worth to me? And you start again to see the breakdown in demand curves, because it's something I don't really pay for. I get benefits from it. What would I be willing to pay for his rodent control services? I could probably look up and hire someone and say, what would it take to get my place free of rodents? On the other hand, they're not there anyway because my neighbor takes care of them. So how do I get someone to give me that sort of estimated price point? So these type of free riding and non-exclusive really mess with our traditional way of saying, what's it worth? So we have to come up with other ways of thinking about it. And now we come to, oh, go on.
Back to the point of the parks, how it's you
Mhm.
can't make a price because different people value it differently. Is that in part how the government decides what they're going to pay for, like libraries, parks, highways? Because different people
Absolutely.
value it.
And I'm saying just because it's difficult to do doesn't mean we're not trying all the time. And this is called public policy and how we come up with justifications and the benefits we provide societies and things like that. There's no conceptual demand curve that we can say because it's not a market interaction when we go to public park. It's there, we go, when we go there, now how many people don't go there anyway versus how many people going there because it's just there. It's really hard to get that traditional supply and demand curve impact. What would you as an individual pay for access to that park? You know, it's hard to figure out that. And that's where we lose some of the things we've been comfortable with from a supply and demand point because it's a public good and you can't exclude people in a conventional sense from it. And we also get benefits from it from overlapping.
Another question.
Okay.
With along that same track, if there was libraries and things of that nature, and then they aren't any anymore because they're not valued.
Mm-hmm.
Does part of the society, the minority that does value it very highly, just say, all right, that's not a public good, so we're just gonna have to find it another way?
Well,
Or
I mean, that can
who gets to decide?
Again, and then we're getting more into political sociological arguments where if we suddenly decide to stop doing something.
Like building a road? Like,
well, I mean, building a road tends to be very, well, actually, I hate to say it, but that's actually another good example of free riding. I have a road outside building road outside my property, which is paid for by the county. I'm not in any city municipality. But I know people from Beaverton go by my road because it's north-south, straight from Shoals Ferry up to Farmington. People cut through that road all the time from Beaverton to cut through to Low and Hillsborough. Did their taxes, contribute the most to that road or not? They're free riding a bit by using that public road. It's a public road. Did they pay for it as much as I did? Well, I can't tell for sure. And this is where part of that demand, because what do they pay for it? I don't know exactly how much they paid, their taxes went to it, but not. But it's a public road. They're using it. It's part of Washington County. But if someone drives up from Salem, they didn't pay any taxes to Washington County, and they use that to cut through to go to the Oklahoma winery, are they free riding on my taxes?
Is a toll road kind of a not an alternative, but like not a solution, but I don't know the word for it.
I mean, toll
Something
roads
that spawns
again,
out.
And it's a really good point to bring up how you do that, but that's a governmental idea to pay for a public good. Theoretically, I mean, really got to know what toll roads were. That they help subsidize the cost of a public good is theoretically what they're doing. That might not otherwise be able to pay for, and so yeah, you are paying incidentally for that. As every toll you're paying, you are paying for that use, and governments do in that case because it's something different. And toll road usually there has to be. I shouldn't say always, but technically getting to government political science here, there has to be, if you put a toll road, it has to be some other way of getting to that route because, and that's
so there should be an alternative.
Yeah, even if it takes you 3 hours and get it instead of 5 minutes. Try driving through Seattle without going through the toll roads. But it's far worth it was worth $3 to pay for that toll road to get cut off, going around the Cape. But so yeah, there are ways of government. That's more of a mechanism of payment mechanism than it is a supply demand mechanism. Yes, if they push, the government does make the supply demand decisions. If they put the tolls too high, how high? If you make it $100, then fine. I'll drive that extra 45 minutes to go around to get the Puget Sound. I mean, if it's $3, okay, I'll pay it. it saves you the time. So the government has to make these types of decisions because there's a point where their public will just say, hey, I'm not going to pay it, and you never get your money back for what you're paying.
So that's not a free ride problem or
No, it's not free rider because you'll be paying for the toll unless the government can't track you down because you go through Seattle. I mean, we didn't have a permit, but we drove on the toll road and they sent us a bill a week later. Cool.
Mhm.
We paid more than the $1.85 it would if we prepaid, but we didn't know we were going there. So that's not a free rider because you're actually paying as you go on that. So that's not a free rider on that, but a free rider could be, again, as they use it. Well, let's go through
Okay.
on actually, that's a great segue to externalities. Now, externalities, and this is the next concept, and this is probably one of the most important concepts that applies not just to like business economics, but it affects every one of us and how we do things. This is a cost or benefit, and this sort of leads away from what Marcus was asking, to a third party external to the transaction, meaning businesses get together and consumers interact with suppliers, yet there's an impacted cost or benefit to someone who's not involved directly in that transaction and that is not necessarily an intended, or say really is not an intended cost or benefit to someone. So it might be that, okay, this nice pulp paper factory opens up, as it used to all be up the Columbia River. I know because my dad made a lot of the mixing equipment that went into those former pulp paper plants along the border between Oregon and Washington. Well, they may put, in the old days, some forms of pollution in the Columbia River. Well, a negative externality is that pollution that's coming out of their plant. They didn't open the plant for the purposes of polluting the river. Polluting the river was a consequence of them, creating paper pulp for those of us so we can have nice pieces of paper on our, well, it doesn't show up in front of the owl, but so we get a nice piece of paper. They're white and bleachy. And my dad's mixers used to mix bleach. And in the old days, before we had the modern lighting systems, they dumped, in the 70s, they dumped a heck of a lot of this waste product into Columbia, which then impacted people downstream who suddenly had this stinky paper pulp mixture going by their houses. The consequence of that was a negative externality on those homeowners, hunters, fishermen that had this icky stuff, sludgy coming down their river. Now again, I say not intended, an intended result of the business. The purpose of the paper pulp plant was not to pollute the river. A result of their being there was polluting the river, but that was not the purpose of their being there. And so the benefit cost of people, making paper from a producer standpoint and selling it to people who wanted the paper, that was the business transaction. Makers of paper, buyers of paper. But the third party who wasn't involved in that buying and selling transaction are people down the river who were impacted negatively from the business operations, because in order to provide that paper for that buyer of paper, they polluted the river. That pollution was the negative externality. Positive externality, the classic one we talk about in a minute is, hey, education systems. We'll talk about that more in a minute, where theoretically, they've done also studies that say, hey, a highly educated population is benefit to society. They are more prosperous with a highly educated society. And so you may be going to school so you can get a better job, have a successful career, but other people benefiting by having a highly educated population, even though you may not have gone to school for the sole purpose of benefiting society around you, although I have had some students, especially in retirement, that do that. But you went there to be successful so you can be better in your career, get promotions. That was the purpose of you getting into that transaction with the school system that you chose to go to. But other people who don't know you may benefit because we have more educated people in society. Now then, here's the trick on externalities. When I scan this, this is the Dictionary of Economics. It's been around since World War II. And I bring this up when I say externalities is one of those things that get people a lot of tied up but it's probably the single biggest concept that justifies how public goods and government interacts in and around us. This is the 1970 edition of Dictionary of Economics. I have it on my shelf, inherited it from my dad. I bring that up because this is the page up here on page 160 where there's an economic concept missing. Anyone want to guess what that is?
Externalities?
Externalities aren't even worth mentioning in 1970. In the Dictionary of Economics, a highly respected thing, they make editions of it to this day. In 1970, it wasn't even worth mentioning. Today is the single biggest item that justifies a great deal of, I'm trying to be apolitical when I say this, a great deal of intervention, for good or ill, depending on your point of view, of government because of externalities. After 1970, Richard Nixon started the Environmental Protection Agencies. Other things took off in that regard in the 1970s, and they started talking about something called externalities. And externalities actually wasn't really talked about by Adam Smith in his famous Wealth of Nations, which is what we all talk about. And I showed you my nice picture next to him on the Royal Mile. He dealt with it from a standpoint in a book, because a lot of people don't realize that Adam Smith, the father of modern economics, was actually primarily an ethics philosopher. And he mentioned it in his book, Theory of Moral Sentiments, where he talked about the impact of sales transactions and that we should be ethical in how we do our sales transactions. But we've gone in since 1970 from having something that wasn't even worth mentioning in the Dictionary of Economics to something we're spending a chapter on. And if you're getting a master's in economics, you'll have entire courses on this. It's become that impactful since I was a kid. Where's externality? It ain't there. It was a philosophy that's gone from being a philosophical discussion to a public policy justification. Think about when we already talked about public goods and all that type of stuff. So positive externalities. Again, talk about some of these all, so I'll just go through quickly, but pretty flowers I can see from my neighbor's yard. Did you pay for those flowers? You're enjoying it. You didn't pay for them, but you like it. It's a positive thing. I like seeing flowers. I like seeing the well-tilled, rodent-free field of wheat out my backyard. I'm not paying for it, but I'm enjoying watching it. It's really pretty. Nice, smooth leaves, golden breeze, fine. On the other hand, I also enjoy shade because he has some giant Douglas firs that shade us in the hottest part of the summer. Cool. So we already talked about college educations. So these are all things that you're not part of the transaction that made it happen, but you benefit from something positively based on interactions, economic interactions of other parties. He buys seed from people and plants wheat. I didn't pay for the seed. I didn't pay to plant the wheat, though I do go help him move his hose pipe some days, so maybe that's my guilt-free for free riding. But sort of, it's something that I didn't do with him to create this externality. Negative externalities, when you have a big party, you weren't invited to the party, but there's noise that keeps you up all night. That's the cost to me. It kept me up all night. Lower property values, when someone has trash and weeds in their front yards, it lowers your property value. You're not involved in the buying and selling of their house, but it affects you economically. Air pollution is the big thing, or any type of pollution that's around you. You may not be involved in that factory, whether it does pulp paper or creosote manufacturing, but if it creates pollution, you're not directly involved in that economic transaction, but it has an impact on you that's negative. Meaning you get polluted air or polluted water. Those types of things are externalities that are negative upon us from some independent buying, selling interaction. Any questions on this so far? Well, this now becomes things that we want to talk about cost. And these diagrams in the chapter get a little tricky. And we talk about negative externalities and costs. And this is where we have to sort of sometimes look at the term cost in terms of these externality parts of this chapter and saying, okay, you're being negatively impacted by that noisy party next door that you weren't invited to, that's a cost to you. How do we quantify that cost gets the tricky part, and that's done all the time in government, but that there is a way to quantify it, but it becomes tricky. Now then, a negative externality, when the producer's costs not reflect the full cost of resources, not reflected in the price, meaning, okay, we're here at P0 and we're buying, paper, okay? And this is a few years ago before they were not allowed to pour their excess stuff into the Columbia River. But if that producer had to have the impact of the full costs of that externality, meaning the pollution, I'm down the street when I'm trying to fish and I get this pollution coming down past my bass boat, that cost to me, that creates a cost. I'm not enjoying it, can't get fish, the fish are dying. That has a cost, I use that in quotes, to me. That's that negative externality. Well, the producer doesn't feel that cost. He's dumping it out, getting the benefits, just throwing his stuff into the Columbia River and selling his paper cheap because he doesn't have to clean it up. So we say, oh, okay, well, we're down here at Q0, P0 because we're buying that because the producer doesn't have to worry about that pollution just going down the road. That was in 1970. He might not want to do it because Adam Smith said, ethically, it's not right. Okay, in his theory of moral sentiments. But if he doesn't care about the ethics part and just worry about the costs, his cost-effective, cheapest way of doing it is to throw the stuff down the river, which impacts everyone else negatively. And that's where we have this starting point. You're just letting it go down the river. And so he's selling it to us cheaper. Are we maybe benefiting from that cheap paper? Yeah, but we're also paying a price because the fish are dying around my bass boat. So then we say, all right, if he actually had the impact or take the impact of those additional costs, the price would really be up at P1 because his costs would go up, so we'd have to sell at a higher price. And this is where I pause and say, we really miss on that part, that if he had to pay for those costs, like maybe he had to clean them up instead of dumping them, he'd then be experiencing the full price of those costs. And his price to the consumer would go up. And similarly, we would buy less of it though, because given our supply and demand curves, we buy less of stuff when it's more expensive. So if he has to raise his price from P0 to P1 on this diagram, we're intending to buy less of it. Now then, here is where the public policy comes in standpoints. Do laws that want to mitigate in government the negative externalities, so we now start fining the person if he dumps stuff into the Columbia River. We put sort of a tax, if you will. And let's not get into the minutia of when does tax and a fine stop being each other. We charge that supplier something because he's dumping stuff into the Columbia River, which adds to his costs, which rises it up to from P0 to P1, and he's not willing to supply as much at that higher cost. We're not willing to buy, or you may not be willing to that, but we're not willing to buy as much at that higher price. But now his price is reflecting the full cost of that pollution. Whereas before we were just taking it as a negative externality. So to encourage him to reduce that negative externality, we now fine him if he does it. Well, again, so now he has to install all sorts of pollution controls to stop dumping it in there, and society, as in the government entity, whoever's oversight has it, which is federal at that point, says, nope, you can't do it, you have to pay for that. Price goes up, consumers get less stuff. But they have fewer externalities that are negative. And that is one of the key things of public policy that affects us not just as business, but as people. This is how it works. They look at this, and really environmental issues that really came to head on the 70s after we got the EPA involved and other entities of oversight and FDA oversight. Consumer protection. The other thing that Nixon did was the Consumer Product Safety Commission was started under him. He may have gone down in the scandal with Watergate, but he actually did some good stuff before then. Invented model environmental oversight and consumer protection oversights that didn't exist before. So, but there's a cost to those, and that cost is shifting to the producer, which drives us his cost and causes us to have less. And this is the demand, the sort of the argument we have every time new regulations come to play. The political argument is you're going to raise the costs of producers. If you raise the cost of producers, they pass that on to consumers. In this case, by passing those costs on to the consumers, we're now going to only be able to get it at P1 instead of P0. At P1, we're willing to buy less. And you get into the argument, well, now the supplier is going to be supplying at this rate because we have the green supply line still. So it causes a supply curve to shift. Consumers get less of it because it's a higher price. But you have fewer externalities. And this is the back and forth in political arguments about what we want to regulate and what fees, taxes, or whatever you want to impose. Long-winded thing, but this is happening around us every day in government. And depending whether you like one particular element of what they're regulating or not, you think it's a good thing or a bad thing. Whew, long-winded stuff. Any questions on that before I go to the next slide? Either it was really dumbfounded or you all get it.
So negative externalities are given to the producer so that they will have to essentially produce less at a higher cost, which will then make the supply less and then hopefully balance out.
Well, okay, for one of the premises I'm going to say negative is how you phrased it, and I may have misunderstood. I say negative externalities are given to the producer. Negative externalities are out there, and a oversight entity might do something like tax them or pass regulations that say, no, you cannot dump sewage into the river, which raises suppliers' cost, so that we have, so we're like, he might have been here, S1 at Q0. Well, by raising the cost of the supplier, he's no longer willing to supply the same amount at that price. And this is a big argument. You see this all the time arguing, well, will the supplier pass the cost on to the consumer? Well, by going from the point P0, Q0, oops, moving that up with the great special effects, yes, he's passing the cost on to the consumer. He's raising his price. Our demand from the consumer hasn't changed, but he's no longer willing to supply the amount Q0 at P0 because P0 doesn't cover his costs. We may have taxed him or made him incur additional costs to stop polluting. So now he adds, though his costs have gone up, so he's no longer willing to supply the same amount of stuff at that price P0 on this graph. He's now going to supply at P1 price, which means his whole supply curve has shifted up. He's no longer willing to supply the same amount at the same price because his costs have gone up. Demand hasn't changed. People still want Q0 at the old equilibrium price of P0, Q0. The consumer may want it, but now they can't get it because the supplier has to pay more to make his product. That can be done by either regulations that say now you have to install this cleaning equipment, or, and this is a big part of, you hear the cap and trade, where people just want to charge you in form of some taxation or penalty if you pollute. I'm not saying you can't pollute, but if you pollute, we're going to charge you for it. And if you under pollute, you can sell your pollution credits to someone else. So the great scams that started in the 70s. If you're really non-polluter, you can sell, and this is what finding this right supply-demand intersection is. If you're non-polluter with cap and trade, well, you get pollution credits for not polluting. You can sell those credits to polluters who then say, here, I don't have to stop polluting. I just buy credits from the person who is not polluting, and I still pollute the same amount. Create a whole market for when the Congress said you can buy and sell pollution credits. You don't believe me? Look it up, Wall Street Journal. Now then, positive externality. This is analogous, but when the benefit of the output is not reflected by the consumer's price, meaning there's an underallocation of resources, insufficient demand, basically because I'm enjoying something I don't have to pay for. Isn't that cool? Yep. And so we got our initial equilibrium standpoint where before the changes were due to supply because the produced by trying to stop this negative externality happening, public policy said we're going to impose a tax or make you install equipment, which is expensive, to not pollute. So that shifted the supply curve because the supplier is no longer willing to supply the same stuff at the same amount. His prices went up, he's passing on to us. So in this case, well, the demand might shift because we're saying now we're going to take you and make you pay for that view. If you like the look of your neighbor's flowers, we're going to impact a liking the flowers tax and give it to the demander. So you can pay for the benefit because you're not incurring those costs of seeing those flowers. So we're going to give a flower tax so that we're going to compensate for that. And so maybe now, here you, cool, at P0, Q0, my demand's right there, that intersection, we're equilibrium. Cool, I love those flowers, but now you're going to charge me? Well, I'm not going to look at them as often because I don't want to get taxed that much. So looking at the flowers costs me more at P1. So we're going to change necessarily, your demand curve is going to shift. I don't want to look at those flowers as much anymore because it costs me to look at them. So that's when you shift things to make you pay for something that you were enjoying without benefit. And this gets really controversial when you think about all the different ways that we do things in our life. You know, you might want to use that park. So we're going to charge you people that use that national park more. A few years ago, they actually had to come up with a way of doing this where the people just were not benefiting. People weren't paying camping fees for the park. They were just going for day use. So a few years ago in the 90s, national parks, it was really started charging for parking. It's still free to go to national parks. If you park, we're going to charge you. Now, when we deal with these things, you got to think about the purposes. This is we call the Pigovian taxes come into play. And this, you're actually dealing with this on your assignment question this week, which we'll talk about more in a minute. Negative externalities and positive externalities, are done to increase things or decrease things. Now, by that means, the gas tax is a famous one, which is always controversial when you raise and lower it. The original purpose of the gas tax, when they first started coming in the 50s, when you got interstate highway systems, was to help maintain roads. That was the purpose of the gasoline tax. It was a road maintenance fee. Nowadays, the purpose of that tax has shifted, where now there's a large group saying that, hey, we want to make gasoline more expensive so people won't use gasoline as much because they're worried about pollution, fossil fuel consumption, and all those. So the original part of it was really gasoline was a method of supporting public goods called roads. But now the Pigovian, it's now becoming a Pigovian tax is trying to drive behavior. And this is where, letting someone back in. And this is where when we talk about taxes and what they're supposed to do, are they trying to encourage things or discourage things? Are they maintaining public goods or are they trying to drive usage one way or the other? They don't always say that. They say the gas tax is a great example. It went from public good funding to now the gas tax is viewed as something, is still justified by road maintenance. But one of the big things with different types of cars and hybrids and stuff, which don't use gasoline, well, now the big idea is maybe we're shifting the nature of that tax from gasoline taxes from oh, no longer supporting roads because there's lots of people free riding. If you have an electric car and you don't pay gasoline, are you now a free rider on public roads? Huge political controversy on this right now. And that's why they're talking about different ways of taxing cars and mileage and all that. And the gas tax is being viewed in the politics a little bit more as a, let's try and stop people from using fossil fuels. Make it a penalizing tax to raise the price to the consumer so that we use less taxes or less gasoline. Because we have learned, and I use that example during the first couple of years of the Obama administration, where we had a massive tax increase, or excuse me, price increase in gasoline, went up to $4 or $5 a gallon in some places, parts of the country. And we finally learned that yes, in that terms of elasticity versus inelastic, we always thought that people would buy gasoline no matter what the price, and when it started hitting $4.50, $4.75, $5 a gallon, their elasticity standpoints changed in this country and found out there is a point where they stop buying gasoline. And so that's encouraged people to say, let's buy more gasoline from a standpoint of discouraging fossil fuel consumption. But it's also complicated politically because it's also a road maintenance thing. And if you discourage people, and it comes down to this is where you talk about the public policy questions that are going to come up on this, and what about this, and different scenarios. But you do tend to have diminishing returns. Think about the concepts in this book. We'll talk about law of diminishing returns, where if you raise it so much that you discourage people from using it, well, then you lose out on the benefits of road maintenance funding for the tax. And I'm not going to get into that political discussion about what the right thing is, but these are the types of things that are affecting us all the time, discussion being had in government. And it comes down again to why externalities in 1997 weren't even worth mentioning, but now the concept of externalities is massively impactful to our daily lives, not just as business people, but just citizens sitting in this room or in different rooms. So I missed your question. So the quantity demanded goes up. If we're talking about when it comes to a positive externality, the actual quantity demanded, the positive externality may cause demand to go down actually sometimes. And it's a question of where now the supplier is still supplying. If it's a positive externality, the supplier still may be supplying what they can as they always have. Your neighbor is still putting the flowers in because he likes flowers. But you may actually want less of it or be willing to pay that amount, essentially, for that positive externality. It's not always that simple. And the quantifying of this is one of the great things that causes controversy and political argument, because we already admit that certain public goods, can't be quantified in traditional demand policies. And then how do you quantify the pretty view I have so you can charge me for it because I'm enjoying my neighbor's land by looking over his 13 acres and a nice view of the Coast Range? As I tell my friends, I have a view I don't have to pay for. If I was charged for that, every time I look out the window, at what point will I look out the window less? These are the arguments that government has where they don't want to diminish you're utilizing these good things, but how do you allocate the proper way to pay for them? And if it sounds complicated, it's because it is. And if there was a surefire way to do it, I'm sure that all our government leaders would be going to camp together and playing with their kids at the park together. But it's one of those things, devils is in the details on how you allocate these things from a public policy standpoint. What do you subsidize? Again, for this week's assignment, you got to talk about school subsidies, Bogovian taxes for schools. And generally, it talks about, most of your education almost everywhere is subsidized by taxes somehow. Anyway, we're going to hold that thought for a minute until we get to that part. So government's role in the economy. And this is where we get all those things. And this is the government can have and does have a role in correcting externalities. The Environmental Protection Agency tracks in how we pollute and where we pollute. and calculates how much you can pollute and passes laws to get the right pollution amounts. And the book goes into some of those diagrams about how we try to figure out what the right pollution amount is. How much can we allow pollution? And we deal on some people on some ends that say, no, it's not the problem, not important to the oceans. Some people say, not a single drop of anything should ever leave the planet. It's not like drink rainwater. The truth and reality is in between. But the government does, on the basis of the concept of that externalities over the last, 50 years now, has really gotten involved, and externalities is the economic justification for it. You've got to correctly identify the existence and the cause, which isn't always easy. That's the old Shakespeare, that's the rub. And no, it's in the context of politics, it doesn't make it easy. But it's out there, it's impacting us every day, whether you believe it or not. And you can look at the State of Union last night and every other president, they're talking about different costs, different things, and different avenues. But this is how intervention, if you will, for good or ill, into markets and our daily lives is justified. Right or wrong, I'm not getting into, but it's how it's justified. And the quantifying of it is horrifically complicated. But we try to do it all the time. Certain things can be measured. We can measure how much in pounds of pollutants plants put out. We can measure that. You can measure it, but right mitigation, how much we're going to let out versus not. No, how many power plants are we willing to put out of business to have zero emissions? It's very complicated.
On that question, or on that answer of like percentages, is there a percentage of free rider, like the percentage of free rides in the economy, or like the percentage of people that would benefit freely from this without getting taxed or having to pay for one thing or another?
Well, I mean, this is the great question. That's why we employ thousands of analysts at federal, state, and local to look at this very thing. And how do you determine that? And it gets argued in the courts all the time, and studies on top of studies on top of studies into what should be allowed. And this is, we elect our politicians. We're representative form of government largely in this country. And it's not an easy question of how much we should allow. Negative externalities generally are easier to measure than positive, because we can measure how many pounds of sludge or how many cubic yards of sludge are dumped off somewhere. We can measure particulates in the atmosphere. And we generally can measure how much it's going to be to correct some of these things. But from a public policy standpoint, how much the correction of this gets into all the stuff we talked about so far in this. And all right, how much do you raise the how much do you raise the price of something before that business goes out of business? And then people stop buying it. And the people that are making that stuff lose their jobs. This is the great political argument that goes on every regulation that's out there. If the government raises it too much, why don't we just stop all pollution? Well, it's hard to do, but we could pass laws to do that. But, things get very expensive, and a lot of people are going to lose their jobs. In the 1950s, I think actually it was 48. London, somebody said that coal burning was too much. They just passed laws in Parliament and said, okay, as of a certain date, I think it was 1948, all coal burning must stop. You're talking about stopping the thing that was a primary source of heat and power for centuries in London. No, you must stop overnight or we'll shut you down. And if you didn't stop burning coal, the government came in and shut them down. And it had a massive upheaval in the 50s that people say caused a lot of impact and negative impact, and people lost their jobs. On the other hand, London has some of the nicest air of any major metropolitan city on the planet now. My parents grew up in the days where the coal fogs were so thick, you had to feel your way along the street to figure out where your house was. There's a cost of it. That's why I said at the beginning, I don't want to get into the politics of it, but there is, why we don't do things in mass sometimes, because there is a trade-off. how many people are you willing to put in poverty versus how much do you want to have free air? You know, I don't have the answer to that question. Those of you who can find that answer, apply for the Nobel Prize. That's what we're dealing with all the time. And it's a difficult question. And sort of philosophically, this is one of the most important chapters in the book because it talks about, again, something that wasn't even worth mentioning in the primary economic text of the time in 1970 now drives us. And if you ever really are bored one night and want to turn on C-SPAN and watch congressional hearings, you'll find this term coming up all the time. It's out there. Just Google externalities in an industry. And it's out there now, whereas some people just never heard it before. So, I'm going to talk about assignment gamma. And this is where we're going to deal with this concept. They're always at the top, most people are getting pretty good on their APA submission guidelines, but we're going to talk about the externalities called education. Something that everyone here should be relating to, because unless you've hacked in, you're involved in some educational activities here. And you're paying for some. And tuition's expensive. I know, I pay for it. But believe it or not, and this is national data, about 2/3 of tuition costs on the average college are paid for by government. Unless you think how expensive tuition is, think how expensive it would be if you had to pay that full, and here's where you think about these terms, you had to pay that full cost. Are you guys free riding? If you're not paying taxes, you might be. Are you guys free riding on the American taxpayer? Or are we recognizing as a society, that's what this question talks about, the benefit of an educated populace? Our founding fathers wrote extensively about this, about the vital nature of having an educated population, which is why we have public schools for kids and stuff like that. People talk about now, last night at the State of the Union, we're talking about, do we get, all colleges for the first 2 years, the community colleges paid for free? Should we do that? So think about this in terms of a Pigovian tax. This is going to require a lot of thinking, and this is one of those things where I say, think through it. There is not a particular right or wrong answer this week. You're going to be judged on how well you support your positions. If you want to take the position that education shouldn't be paid for by any single dollars by the public, anywhere, every time, anyhow, cool. As long as you can justify it. Don't just say, I think it's rotten, and sign your paper. Think about how you can justify the positions you take on these questions. Because a lot of it is, as we talk about tonight, some of this gets tricky. How much is education worth? In 1962, 4.2% of the population had college degrees in the United States. Today it's close to 40 and climbing. That's why they let my dad into the country, because he had a degree in physics when no one else had degrees in physics. So they let him come into the country. In the old days, it took a lot more to get into the country because you had to justify income, education. Why did they let this foreigner into the country? Oh, he had a degree in physics. Okay, you can come. Because they needed for national security, so he could build bigger and better bombs for us. So think about that as we go through it, and think about how you're going to justify in the context of the term. This is more a bit of you can get very numbers oriented this if you want, but think about the concepts you're being asked about, and don't skip a question. Sometimes people get to the first question and think, oh, that was hard, and they forget the other two. Answer all the questions you're being asked. Any questions on that before I go to the next slide? Hearing none. Nothing on the chat. Let me check for you. Week 5 posting. This is a different 5, so everyone's going to be really under pressure. Some of you on your grades this week notice that you got dinged on your participation grade if you didn't post by Friday. Posting by 10 p.m. on Sunday night doesn't give a good interaction. And it's more important this week because you guys are creating the questions for your classmates. I'm providing you with an article or question on your posting. This time, everyone's going to come up with an article and post it with something about it. And you're going to have to go to someone else's posting and read their article and answer their questions. So pose a question, look for an article. Keep it a relevant news article. Don't come up with some like blog that said some obscure things like space aliens are really driving free landing and flowers, or free riding flowers. But come up with something relevant to one of the topics. I don't care if it's from week 1 to week 5. Doesn't have to be in externalities. Something we talked about or is written in the book. Some article. Post it with a question, and make sure you have a link that people can find your article. You just say some article in Wall Street Journal from 2008. If I click on it and I can't find it, make sure, that's why it's best, you don't have to do it online, but if you don't give an online article, make sure you put a citation so people can find it. Otherwise, if you find a cool article, try and keep it relevant, not just an opinion column somewhere, but legitimate article on this. But posting early is going to be critical, or at least by Friday on time, because you're going to have to post something for other people to do, and other people are going to do vice versa. So if you don't post your article till 11:59 on Sunday, no one's going to have a chance to comment on it. And probably the first person to post it is going to get lots of comments and questions. So get your first initial posting by Friday, not just for the sake of my saying so, but have mercy on your classmates who are going to need your article so they can do their replies and their comments. Any questions on that? Looking at the chat, no one's answering questions. All right, now today's breakout. There isn't one. This is where everyone should say, "Aww."
Aww.
Thanks for playing. Okay. All righty. No, Chris, you're supposed to have a very sad face, but thanks for playing. All right. All right, the majority have happy. All right, there we go. Okay. So, any questions before I say goodbye for tonight? Hearing none, I'm about to say goodbye to everyone, and be safe out there. And I look forward to your articles. All right. Look forward to reading them. Good night, everyone.
Good night. Have a great rest of your week.
Thank you.